In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a joyous bachelor party at Hartley Manor takes a dark turn when the charming groom-to-be, Thomas Hartley, vanishes into the night. As whispers of debts and secrets swirl, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet knitting, unravels a web of greed and betrayal. A ruthless creditor, a guilty brother, a polished best man, and a meticulous planner all hide truths that lead to a chilling abduction. In just 7 days, Miss Marple's keen observations uncover a plot driven by a £5,000 debt, revealing that even in a sleepy village, danger lurks behind every rosebush. Will she stitch together the clues before the shadows claim another victim? Chapter 1. The festivities begin, the late summer evening draped Hartley Manor in a golden haze, its ivy-clad walls glowing softly under the fading sun. St. Mary Mead, that unassuming village nestled in the English countryside, thrummed with quiet excitement, for the marriage of Thomas Hartley to Clara Weston was the talk of every parlor and pub. The manor, though grand in its Georgian bones, bore the faint shabbiness of a family whose fortunes had waned, and tonight it played host to Thomas's bachelor party, a celebration orchestrated with meticulous care, yet tinged with an undercurrent. Miss Jane Marple could not quite ignore Miss Marple. A distant cousin of the Hartley matriarch had arrived at the manor 2 days prior. Her presence requested more out of politeness than necessity. She sat now in a cushioned armchair by the drawing-room's tall windows, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her eyes flitting over the scene with the deceptive mildness of a woman who saw far more than she let on. The room was alive with laughter and clinking glasses, the air thick with cigar smoke and the scent of polished oak. Young men in dinner jackets moved about, their voices rising in boisterous toasts to the groom-to-be. Thomas Hartley, at 30, was the picture of vitality, tall, with a mop of dark hair and eyes that sparkled with reckless charm. He stood at the center of the room, a glass of champagne in hand, regaling his friends with a tale of a misadventure in Monte Carlo. His best man, Roger Blake, a barrister with a broad grin and a knack for storytelling, matched Thomas quip for quip, his laughter booming over the gramophone's lively tune. Roger's easy confidence, Miss Marple noted, carried a trace of calculation, as if he were always performing for an unseen audience. Victor Grange, the party's planner, flitted about like a nervous conductor, adjusting the placement of a silver tray or murmuring instructions to the footman. His thin frame and sharp features gave him an air of precision, but his eyes darted too often, betraying a man who feared imperfection. Miss Marple's needles paused as she observed Victor pause to scold a servant over a smudged glass, his voice low but cutting. A man so devoted to detail, she mused, might miss the broader picture. In a quieter corner stood Philip Hartley, Thomas's younger brother, his face half-shadowed by the flicker of candlelight. Philip, at 26, lacked his brother's easy grace, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. He clutched a glass of whiskey, his gaze fixed on Thomas with an intensity that Miss Marple found curious, part affection, part something less definable. She made a mental note of it, her fingers resuming their steady rhythm. Earlier that day, as she'd taken her customary walk through the manor's rose garden, Miss Marple had glimpsed a stranger lingering at the wrought-iron gate. He was gaunt, his coat ill-fitting, his eyes sharp and unyielding. The gardener, a garrulous man named Tompkins, had whispered that the stranger was Leonard Cobb, a creditor known in the village for his relentless pursuit of debts. "Owes him a pretty penny, Mr. Thomas does," Tompkins had said, shaking his head. Miss Marple had nodded politely, storing the information away like a skein of wool. Now, as the party reached its zenith, Thomas raised his glass for another toast, his voice slurring faintly from the champagne. "To love, to life, and to escaping the creditors," he declared, prompting a roar of laughter. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a smile, but her eyes lingered on Philip, who did not laugh, and on Roger, whose grin seemed to tighten. Victor, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. likely fussing over some minor detail in the dining room. As the clock struck 11, Thomas set down his glass and announced he needed a breath of air. "Too much champagne, lads," he said with a wink, slipping through the French doors into the garden. The night swallowed him, and the party carried on. Oblivious to the shift in the air, a shift Miss Marple felt as surely as a change in the wind. She knitted on her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands, sensing that the evening's gaiety was but a prelude to something far less festive. Chapter 2. The empty morning. The dawn broke over Hartley Manor with a deceptive calm, painting the rolling lawns in hues of pink and gold, as if unaware of the turmoil brewing within its walls. The previous night's revelry had left the grand house in a state of disheveled splendor. Empty champagne flutes littered the drawing room. A velvet curtain hung askew, and the faint scent of cigar smoke lingered in the air. Miss Jane Marple, awake early, as was her habit, sat by her bedroom window, her knitting abandoned for the moment, as she gazed at the mist curling over the garden. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, missed nothing, and her mind was already turning over the events of the bachelor party. Sensing a thread of unease that had begun to unravel, the first sign of trouble came with a sharp rap at her door, followed by the breathless entrance of Mrs. Gibbs, the manor's housekeeper, her round face flushed with agitation. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," she exclaimed, twisting her apron in her hands. "Mr. Thomas, he's gone. Not a sign of him since last night." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, but her voice remained steady as she invited Mrs. Gibbs to sit and recount the matter. It transpired that Roger Blake, the best man, had stumbled upon Thomas's absence when he went to rouse him for a planned morning ride. Thomas's bedroom, on the second floor, was untouched, his evening clothes draped carelessly over a chair, his bed unslept, and Roger, bleary from the night's excesses, had rallied the other guests, and a hasty search of the manor and its immediate grounds had yielded nothing. The news had spread like wildfire, and by the time Miss Marple descended to the drawing room, the house was a hive of anxious voices and hurried footsteps. Clara Weston arrived shortly after, her delicate features pale and drawn, her auburn hair hastily pinned beneath a hat. She was accompanied by her mother, Mrs. Eleanor Weston, a formidable woman whose sharp eyes and rigid posture bespoke a life of commanding obedience. Clara clutched a handkerchief, her voice trembling as she addressed the gathered company. "Where is he? Thomas would never leave without a word. Something's happened, I know it." Mrs. Weston, standing like a sentinel at her daughter's side, fixed each man in the room with a stare that demanded answers. The local constable, Mr. Ernest Reed, arrived soon after, his round face perspiring under his helmet. A good man, he was better suited to settling disputes over stray livestock than unraveling mysteries, and his presence did little to calm the growing tension. He set up in the library, a room lined with dusty tomes and faded portraits, and began questioning the key figures: Roger Blake, Victor Grange, Philip Hartley, and a few other guests who had lingered into the early hours. Miss Marple, unobtrusive, in a corner with her tea, listened intently, her mild expression belying the keen attention she paid to every word. Roger was the first to be questioned, his usual joviality tempered by a furrowed brow. He stood before Constable Reed, his dinner jacket replaced by a rumpled tweed suit, and recounted the evening with a barrister's precision. Thomas was in fine form, he said, his voice carrying a forced cheer. We toasted, we danced, we laughed, nothing out of the ordinary. He said he was stepping out for air, and I thought nothing of it. You know how he is always chasing a whim. When pressed on the exact time, Roger hesitated, rubbing his temple. Must have been around 11, perhaps a quarter past. I didn't check my watch. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand, wondering if it stemmed from fatigue or something less innocent. Victor Grange followed, his thin frame taut with indignation. He produced a leather-bound notebook. its pages filled with meticulous notes on the party's arrangements, timings for the caterers, the playlist for the gramophone, even the precise placement of candelabras. Everything was flawless. He insisted, his voice sharp. I had every detail under control. I stepped away only briefly, to sort out a mix-up with the dessert trays. The kitchen staff were hopeless. Constable Reed, scribbling in his notebook, asked if Victor had seen Thomas leave. No, Victor snapped. I was in the scullery, wasn't I? But the garden doors were open, anyone could have wandered out. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Victor's defensiveness was telling, though whether it hid guilt or merely wounded pride, she could not yet say. Philip Hartley was next, and his demeanor was a stark contrast to the others. He entered the library pale and hollow-eyed, his dark hair falling untidily across his forehead. He sat heavily, avoiding the constable's gaze, and spoke in a low monotone. I didn't stay late, he said. I was tired, too much noise. Too many people. I went to my room before 10, I think. I didn't see Thomas go out. His fingers twisted together, and Miss Marple observed the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Constable Reed, sensing Philip's discomfort, pressed gently. But Philip offered little more, only repeating that he'd retired early. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, recalled Mrs. Gibbs's earlier whisper that Philip had always lived in his brother's shadow, fact that seemed to weigh heavily on him now. The other guests, minor figures in the drama, friends from Thomas's university days, offered vague accounts of the night, their memories blurred by champagne and exhaustion. None had seen Thomas after his exit to the garden, and none mentioned the stranger Miss Marple had glimpsed at the gate. The name Leonard Cobb did not surface, but Miss Marple's thoughts returned to him, prompted by a fleeting glance she'd caught from Philip during the questioning. When Constable Reed mentioned Thomas's financial troubles in passing, Philip's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked toward the window, a gesture so subtle only someone as observant as Miss Marple would have noticed. As the morning wore on, the search of the grounds continued, led by the manor's gamekeeper and a few village lads. They scoured the rose garden, the orchard, and the wooded path leading to the village, but found no trace of Thomas, no footprints, no discarded cigar, no sign of struggle. Clara, pacing the drawing room, grew more distraught, her handkerchief now a sodden rag. He wouldn't run off, she insisted to Miss Marple, who had approached with a quiet offer of tea. Thomas loves me, he promised we'd start anew, free of his troubles. He was going to settle everything before the wedding. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple, patting her hand, noted the emphasis on settle everything. It suggested debts, promises, and perhaps secrets Thomas had kept even from his bride-to-be. Mrs. Weston, overhearing, interjected with a voice like cut glass. If Thomas has met with foul play, I'll see justice done. The Westons do not tolerate such affronts. Her words carried the weight of her family's wealth and influence, and Miss Marple wondered if that wealth had drawn predators to Thomas, like moths to a flame. She recalled the gaunt figure of Leonard Cobb, his sharp eyes and threadbare coat, and the gardener's tale of Thomas's debts. £5,000. Tompkins had set a sum that could drive a desperate man to desperate measures. Miss Marple excused herself and took a turn about the garden, her stout shoes crunching on the gravel path. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and roses, but her thoughts were far from pastoral. She paused by the French doors through which Thomas had exited, examining the stone terrace. A faint smudge of mud caught her eye, barely visible against the gray stone. It was not the print of a shoe, but something broader, like the edge of a sack or a heavy cloth dragged across the ground. She crouched, her knees protesting, and peered closer. The smudge led toward the garden gate, where the gravel gave way to soft earth. There, she found a single, deep impression, a tire mark, perhaps, though too faint to be certain. She straightened, her mind alight with possibilities. Returning to the manor, she sought out Mrs. Gibbs, who was overseeing the maids as they cleared the remnants of the party. Mrs. Gibbs, Miss Marple said gently, did you happen to notice any vehicles near the manor last night? A delivery van, perhaps, or a cart? The housekeeper frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. Now you mention it, miss. I did hear a motor around 10:30, out by the service gate. I thought it was the caterers leaving, but they'd gone earlier. I didn't think much of it at the time. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. A vehicle at the service gate, so close to the time Thomas vanished, it was a thread worth pulling. She rejoined the others in the drawing room, where Constable Reed was attempting to restore order. Roger was organizing a second search, his voice loud with forced confidence, while Victor hovered near the fireplace, muttering about the disruption to his carefully planned schedule. Philip sat apart, staring at the floor, his hands clasped tightly. Clara, seated beside her mother, looked up as Miss Marple entered, her eyes pleading for reassurance. Miss Marple, she said softly, you've seen things like this before, haven't you, in the village, with your knack for noticing things. Do you think Thomas is safe? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind but guarded. My dear, I notice only what people choose to show, and sometimes what they do not. We shall find him, I'm sure. Her words were comforting, but her mind was far from certain. The smudge on the terrace, the tire mark, the motor heard by Mrs. Gibbs, they pointed to something deliberate, something planned. And then there was Philip's unease, Roger's rehearsed account, Victor's absence at a critical moment. Each man had his secrets, and Miss Marple knew that secrets, like weeds, had a way of entangling the truth. As the clock struck noon, the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, the guests dispersing to their rooms or the village to spread word of Thomas's disappearance. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, her tea grown cold, her fingers tracing the edge of her saucer. She thought of Leonard Cobb, the creditor whose shadow loomed over Thomas's bright prospects. She thought of the garden gate, the unguarded moment when Thomas stepped into the night, and she thought of St. Mary Mead, where beneath its tranquil surface, human nature played out its timeless dramas, greed, envy, fear. With a small sigh, she picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady click. The pattern was forming, slowly but surely, and Miss Marple was determined to see it through. Chapter 3. Whispers of death. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawns of Hartley Manor, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill of uncertainty that had settled over the household. The search for Thomas Hartley had yielded no new clues, and the village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with speculation, each whispered theory more fanciful than the last. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the manor's morning room with a cup of Darjeeling and her ever-present knitting, appeared to the casual observer as merely a genteel spinster passing the time. But her mind was a hive of activity, sorting through the morning's revelations like a seamstress threading a needle through intricate embroidery. The morning room, with its chintz curtains and faded watercolors, offered a quiet retreat from the clamor of the drawing room, where Clara Weston and her mother held court, their voices rising in sharp demands for action. Miss Marple had excused herself after offering Clara a few soothing words, sensing that her presence was less needed there than in the undercurrents of the manor, where secrets lurked like dust in forgotten corners. She had spent the past hour in conversation with Mrs. Gibbs, the housekeeper, whose loquacity proved a treasure trove of village gossip and manor lore. Mrs. Gibbs, bustling in with a fresh pot of tea, had been eager to unburden herself. It's the deads, Miss Marple, she confided, her voice low as she glanced toward the door. Mr. Thomas has always been a charmer, but he's got a reckless streak. Investments, he called them stocks, schemes, all sorts of nonsense. Mr. Cobb, that creditor fellow, came calling last week, bold as brass. I heard them arguing in the study, voices raised something fierce. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, encouraged the housekeeper with a nod. The gardener, old Tompkins, saw it too. Mrs. Gibbs continued. Said Mr. Cobb was waving a paper, demanding payment. £5,000, he reckoned. A fortune, that is. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her thoughts quickened. £5,000 was indeed a sum to inspire desperation or retaliation. She recalled the gaunt figure of Leonard Cobb at the manor gate, his eyes like flints in the evening light. Had he been watching the festivities, waiting for an opportunity? The tire mark by the garden gate, the smudge on the terrace. The motor heard by Mrs. Gibbs. These fragments suggested a plan, one that required Thomas to be alone and vulnerable. But how had Cobb known Thomas would step out at precisely that moment? Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the possibility of an accomplice within the manor. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Clara, who slipped into the morning room with a rustle of silk, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple, she said, sinking into a chair, I can't bear this waiting. Everyone's saying Thomas has run off, but I know he wouldn't. He promised me, we promised we'd face everything together. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, leaned forward with a gentle smile. My dear, she said, young men make many promises, and most are sincere. But tell me, what did Thomas say about facing everything? Was there something specific troubling him? Clara hesitated, twisting a ring on her finger, a sapphire. Miss Marple noted, likely an engagement gift. He spoke of debts, Clara admitted softly. He said he'd borrowed money for some ventures that didn't turn out. But he swore he'd settle it all before the wedding, that he'd spoken to someone who could help. He wouldn't tell me more, said it was his burden, not mine. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away this detail. Thomas's assurance suggested either a plan to raise funds, or an arrangement with someone, perhaps Cobb himself, or another figure yet to emerge. And did he seem worried? She asked. Clara shook her head. Not worried, exactly. Determined. He said it was all under control. Miss Marple's smile was reassuring, but inwardly she wondered if Thomas's confidence had been his undoing. A man who believed he could outwit a creditor like Cobb might underestimate the danger. As Clara rose to rejoin her mother, Miss Marple took up her knitting again, her thoughts drifting to the suspects. Roger Blake's polished account of the evening had rung slightly false, like a rehearsed speech delivered one too many times. Victor Grange's absence during the critical moment at the garden gate was convenient, if not suspicious. And Philip Hartley, his reticence and the fleeting look of guilt during the constable's questioning, suggested he knew more than he admitted. But of Leonard Cobb, no one spoke openly, as if his name carried a weight too heavy for casual mention. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple decided to take her afternoon walk through the village, where tongues wagged more freely than within the manor's walls. She donned her sensible hat and coat, her appearance as unthreatening as a vicar's aunt, and set out along the cobbled lane. St. Mary Mead's High Street was a picture of pastoral charm, whitewashed cottages, a bakery wafting the scent of fresh bread, and the Blue Boar Inn, where locals gathered to dissect the day's drama. Miss Marple entered the inn, nodding to the barmaid, a rosy-cheeked girl named Polly, who had a reputation for overhearing more than she should. Afternoon, Miss Marple, Polly said, wiping a glass with a cloth. Terrible business about Mr. Hartley, isn't it? Everyone's got a theory, run off with another woman, some say, or drowned in the mill pond. Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling at a corner table. People do love a story, she remarked. But I wonder, Polly, did you see anything unusual last night? Anyone near the manor who shouldn't have been? Polly's eyes widened, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Well, now you mention it, I did see that Mr. Cobb, the one who chases debts. He was by the manor gate around 9, maybe 10. Had his hat pulled low, like he didn't want to be seen. Gave me the shivers, he did. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her heart quickened. Cobb's presence at the gate, so close to the time of Thomas's disappearance, was no coincidence. "Did he stay long?" she asked. Polly shrugged. "Not sure. I was busy here, but he wasn't there. When I passed by later, could have gone anywhere." Miss Marple thanked her, leaving a shilling on the table, and stepped back into the sunlight, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. On her return to the manor, she encountered Constable Reed near the stables, his notebook now filled with scrawled notes. "Any progress, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone hopeful but weary. She shook her head gently. "Only observations, Constable. But I wonder if you've looked into Mr. Cobb's movements last night. He seems a figure of interest." Reed frowned, jotting down the name. "The creditor. I'll have a word with him, though he's a slippery sort. Never around when you want him." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the garden gate, where the tire mark still lingered in her memory. Back in the morning room, she resumed her knitting, the click of her needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Cobb's argument with Thomas, his loitering at the gate. The motor heard by Mrs. Gibsall pointed to a man with motive and opportunity, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. The manor held other secrets: Roger's forced cheer, Victor's convenient absence, Philip's silent burden, and then there was Clara's faith in Thomas, a faith that might blind her to his flaws. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple's needles moved faster, weaving not just wool, but the threads of a mystery that grew ever more intricate. Someone in St. Mary Mead knew where Thomas was, and she intended to find out who. Chapter 4. The Best Man's Tale. The evening shadows stretched long and thin across Hartley Manor's polished floors, mirroring the taut nerves of its inhabitants. The second day of Thomas Hartley's absence had settled over St. Mary Mead like a fog, muting the village's usual cheer. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the manor's oak-paneled dining room, observed the subdued gathering at dinner. The clink of cutlery was subdued, the conversation strained, as if each guest feared their words might betray a hidden truth. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked into her capacious handbag, sipped her soup with the air of one entirely at ease, though her keen eyes missed nothing. Roger Blake, the best man, sat at the head of the table, his usual ebullience dimmed but not extinguished. He wore a crisp shirt, his tie slightly loosened, and his broad face bore the flush of a man who had fortified himself with a glass or three of brandy before dinner. Clara Weston, seated opposite, picked at her food, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. Mrs. Weston, ever the sentinel, cast sharp glances at Roger, as if weighing his every gesture. Philip Hartley was absent, having pleaded a headache, and Victor Grange, the party planner, hovered near the sideboard, fussing over the placement of a decanter. Miss Marple noted the tension in Victor's shoulders, the way his fingers twitched as he adjusted the crystal small signs of a man uneasy in his own skin. The meal was interrupted by Constable Reed's arrival, his helmet tucked under his arm, his face etched with the frustration of a man chasing shadows. He had spent the day canvassing the village, questioning laborers and shopkeepers, but had found no trace of Thomas. "I've spoken to half of St. Mary Mead," he said, accepting a chair and a cup of tea. "No one saw Mr. Hartley after he left the party. It's as if the earth swallowed him." His words hung heavy, and Clara stifled a sob. Miss Marple, stirring her tea, decided it was time to probe further into Roger Blake's account, for his polished narrative from the morning had left a faint aftertaste of artifice. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice mild as she turned to Roger, "you were so kind as to share your recollections of the party this morning. But I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity and tell us again about your time with Thomas that night. You were such close friends, after all." Her tone was gentle, almost apologetic, but her eyes were sharp as needles, watching for the flicker of unease she suspected would follow. Roger leaned back, his smile a touch too wide. Of course, Miss Marple, happy to help. He launched into his tale with the practiced ease of a barrister addressing a jury. Thomas was the life of the party, as always. We were thick as thieves have been since Oxford. We toasted, too. His future with Clara, swapped stories of our misspent youth, and even had a silly wager about who could manage the foxtrot better. He was in top form, laughing, joking, nothing to suggest he'd vanish. He paused, sipping his brandy, and Miss Marple noted the careful cadence of his words, as if each had been chosen to paint a specific picture. And when he stepped out, for air, she prompted, "Did you see which way he went? The garden is quite large, and the night was dark." Roger's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered. "Well, he went through the French doors, toward the rose garden. I think. I didn't follow, too busy keeping the lads entertained. Next thing I knew, he hadn't come back." His fingers drummed lightly on the table, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as one of nervous energy. Though Roger's face remained composed, Constable Red, scribbling in his notebook, asked, "And you didn't think to check on him? A man steps out and doesn't return, you weren't concerned?" Roger's laugh was a shade too hearty. "Thomas is a wanderer, Constable. I thought he'd gone to clear his head, or maybe sneak a cigar. He's not one to be fussed over." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Roger's dismissal was plausible, but it lacked the warmth one might expect from a best man speaking of his closest friend. She decided to press a little further. "Forgive me, Mr. Blake," she said, "but I heard mention of a small disagreement between you and Thomas that night. Something about an old matter, perhaps. These things often seem trivial but can weigh on a friendship." Her tone was light, but her words landed like a pebble in a still pond, rippling through the room. Clara's head snapped up, and Mrs. Weston's eyes narrowed. Roger's hand froze on his glass, and for a fleeting moment his composure slipped, revealing a flash of irritation. "Oh, that," he said, recovering with a chuckle. "A trifling thing, really. Years ago, I lent Thomas a bit of money, nothing serious, a few £100 for some venture or other. He'd forgotten to repay it, and I teased him about it during the party. Just banter, you know, the sort of thing old friends do." He waved a hand dismissively, but Miss Marple caught the glance he darted toward Clara, as if gauging her reaction. Clara's expression softened, but Mrs. Weston's did not, her lips thinning into a line of disapproval. Miss Marple nodded, her face a mask of polite interest. "Of course, old debts do have a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times," she said, her voice almost a murmur. She made a mental note of Roger's loan, few £100, he'd said, but his unease suggested it might carry more weight than he admitted. Had Thomas's failure to repay sparked resentment, or was there more to the story? Roger's role as best man gave him proximity to Thomas, and his account of the evening was suspiciously seamless, like a tapestry woven to conceal a flaw. After dinner, Miss Marple excused herself and took a turn through the manor's gardens, her shawl drawn against the evening chill. The rose garden, where Thomas was last seen, was a maze of thorny bushes and gravel paths, its beauty tinged with an air of neglect. She paused by the French doors, retracing the smudge of mud she'd noticed earlier. It was still there, faint, but unmistakable, leading toward the garden gate. Her eyes followed the path, and she noticed something new, a scrap of paper, caught in the thorns of a rosebush just beyond the gate. She retrieved it with care, using her handkerchief to avoid the prickles, and examined it under the dim light of a nearby lantern. The paper was torn, no larger than a calling card, and bore a few scrawled words, "L.C. £5,000, due." Miss Marple's breath caught. L.C. Leonard Cobb, surely. The sum matched Mrs. Gibbs's account of Thomas's debt, and the word due carried a menacing weight. She tucked the scrap into her reticule, her mind racing. Had Cobb confronted Thomas at the gate, luring him away under the pretense of settling the debt? Or had the paper been dropped by someone else, someone who knew of Cobb's claim and wished to point suspicion in his direction? Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sought out Constable Reed, who was lingering in the hall, his helmet now perched precariously on a side table. "Constable," she said softly, "I wonder if you might look into this." She handed him the scrap of paper, her expression one of mild concern. "I found it near the garden gate. It may be nothing, but—" She trailed off, letting Reed draw his own conclusions. His eyes widened as he read the note, and he nodded briskly. "This could be something, Miss Marple. I'll have a word with Mr. Cobb first thing tomorrow. He's been dodging my questions, but this might flush him out." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a small victory. "You're very kind to humor an old woman's fancies," she said, though she knew Reed was beginning to value her fancies more than he let on. As she climbed the stairs to her room, her thoughts returned to Roger Blake. His story of the party was too neat, his mention of the old debt too carefully casual, and yet the scrap of paper pointed to Cobb, a man whose ruthlessness was whispered about in every corner of St. Mary Mead. Were the two connected, or was Roger's unease a separate thread in the tangled web? In her room, Miss Marple lit a single candle and sat by the window, her knitting resumed but her mind far from idle. The manor was quiet now, save for the distant creak of floorboards and the faint murmur of voices below. She thought of Thomas, his charm and his recklessness, and of the men around him: Roger with his polished facade, Victor with his obsessive control, Philip with his silent burdens, and Cobb, the shadow at the gate, whose presence loomed larger with each passing hour. The scrap of paper was a clue, but not the whole story. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, weaving a pattern as intricate as the mystery itself, and she knew that the truth, like a difficult stitch, would require patience to unravel. Chapter 5. The planner's precision. The third morning since Thomas Hartley's disappearance dawned gray and heavy, with clouds pressing low over St. Mary Mead, as if the heavens themselves mirrored the village's unease. Hartley Manor, once aglow with the promise of celebration, now seemed to sag under the weight of unanswered questions. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with its wilting ferns and cracked panes, sipped her morning tea, her knitting a soft cascade of wool. In her lap, the conservatory, seldom used, offered a vantage point over the garden path where Thomas had last been seen, and Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite the years, traced the route to the gate where the scrap of paper bearing L.C. £5,000 due had been found. The manor was quieter now, the initial frenzy of search parties giving way to a grim resignation. Clara Weston, pale but composed, had taken to writing letters to Thomas's distant relatives, seeking any hint of his whereabouts. Mrs. Weston, her mother, had retreated to the drawing room, issuing commands to the staff with the precision of a general. Constable Reed, dogged but increasingly out of his depth, had promised to confront Leonard Cobb that morning, armed with the incriminating scrap of paper. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Victor Grange, the meticulous planner of the bachelor party, whose absence at the critical moment of Thomas's disappearance nagged at her like a dropped-stitch dot. Victor was in the dining room when Miss Marple found him, his lean frame bent over a ledger, his pen scratching furiously as he tallied expenses from the ill-fated party. His dark hair was slicked back, his tie knotted with almost obsessive neatness, but his eyes, when he glanced up, were rimmed with fatigue. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, "I'm rather busy. The accounts must be settled, regardless of circumstances." His tone carried a faint reproach, as if the disruption of his plans was a personal affront. "Oh, I shan't keep you long, Mr. Grange," Miss Marple replied, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. She settled into a chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. I was merely reflecting on how splendidly organized the party was, so many details, all perfectly arranged. You must have worked tirelessly. Victor's shoulders relaxed slightly, and a flicker of pride crossed his face. It was a challenge, he admitted, but I pride myself on precision. Every guest accounted for, every course timed to the minute. It should have been perfect. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of earnest admiration. And yet, such a pity that you were called away at that crucial moment when Thomas stepped out. The caterer's mix-up, wasn't it? Victor's pen paused, and his eyes narrowed, though he kept his tone even. Yes, a trifling matter. The dessert trays were late, and the staff were utterly incompetent. I had to sort it out myself. Took no more than 10 minutes, I'd say. He flipped a page in his ledger, as if to dismiss the topic. But Miss Marple's needles slowed, her gaze steady. 10 minutes, she mused. Such a small window, yet so much can happen in so short a time. The garden doors were open, I believe. Anyone might have come or gone. Victor's jaw tightened, and he set down his pen with deliberate care. I suppose so, he said, but I wasn't watching the doors. My job was the party, not playing nursemaid to Thomas. His words were sharp, and Miss Marple noted the defensiveness. Like a man shielding a weak spot, she changed tack, her voice softer still. Of course you couldn't be everywhere at once. But I wonder, Mr. Grange, did you notice anyone near the garden gate that night? A stranger, perhaps, or someone unexpected? Victor's fingers twitched, and for a moment he seemed to weigh his response. No one, he said at last. I was in the scullery, as I said. By the time I returned, Thomas was gone. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with apparent sympathy. Such a pity, she said. But your records are so thorough, perhaps they might show who was where at that moment. Victor's expression hardened, and he snapped the ledger shut. My records cover the catering, the music, the seating, not every guest's comings and goings. I'm not a detective, Miss Marple. His tone was curt, and he rose, signaling the end of the conversation. Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile undimmed, but as Victor strode out, she noted the haste in his step, as if he feared lingering too long under her gentle scrutiny. Alone again, Miss Marple turned her attention to the garden visible through the conservatory's glass. The gate, half hidden by a tangle of ivy, was where the tire mark and the scrap of paper had been found. Victor's absence during those 10 minutes was a gap in the evening's timeline, one that aligned too neatly with Thomas's disappearance. Had he truly been in the scullery, or had he slipped out to the gate, perhaps to meet someone? Leonard Cobb's name loomed large, but Miss Marple knew better than to fixate on one thread when the tapestry was so complex. She decided to visit the scullery herself, ostensibly to compliment the staff on their efforts. The kitchen was a bustle of activity, with maids scrubbing pots and a cook kneading dough for the evening's bread. Miss Marple found Elsie, a young scullery maid with a freckled face and a nervous giggle, who had been on duty the night of the party. Oh, Miss Marple, Elsie said, wiping her hands on her apron, it was such a to-do, that party. Mr. Grange was in a right state about the trays, came storming in, shouting about the profiteroles being late. And when was that, my dear? Miss Marple asked, her tone as warm as the kitchen's hearth. Elsie frowned, thinking, must have been just after 10, I reckon. He was here a bit, then went off to the cellar for more wine. Didn't see him after that till the party was winding down. Miss Marple's needles, which she'd retrieved from her bag, clicked softly. The cellar was near the service gate, where Mrs. Gibbs had heard a motor. Victor's story held, but only just, and the cellar's proximity to the garden added a new knot to the mystery. Returning to the conservatory, Miss Marple encountered Constable Reed, his face flushed with the exertion of his morning's work. I've seen Cobb, he said, mopping his brow. Slippery as an eel, that one. Admits he was near the manor that night, but swears he was just passing by, checking on a debtor in the village. Denied knowing anything about Thomas or that note you found. Reed held up the scrap of paper, now sealed in an envelope. I'm having it looked at by a handwriting man in town, but Cobb's not making it easy. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. He's a cautious man, Mr. Cobb, but caution often hides guilt. Did he say anything about his business with Thomas? Reed shook his head. Only that Thomas owed him money, a lot of it. Said he'd been pressing for repayment but wouldn't stoop to violence. I don't trust him, but there's no proof yet. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Proof has a way of surfacing, Constable, if one knows where to look. As Reed departed to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting a steady rhythm against the silence. Victor's meticulous nature was both his strength and his vulnerability. His need for control might have blinded him to a plot unfolding under his nose, or it might have made him the perfect accomplice. The scullery maid's account placed him near the service gate, close to where the motor was heard. And yet, Roger's polished story and Philip's silence still tugged at her thoughts, as did Cobb's shadowy presence. The scrap of paper was a clue, but it was not the whole story. Miss Marple's needles moved faster, her mind weaving through the possibilities, each stitch bringing her closer to the truth, hidden in the folds of St. Mary Mead's quiet drama. Chapter 6. The Brother's Burden. The fourth day since Thomas Hartley's disappearance draped Hartley Manor in a pall of restless quiet, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for answers that refused to come. The village of St. Mary Mead, usually a hive of cheerful gossip, had grown subdued, with every glance and whisper tinged with speculation. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in the manor's library with its sagging shelves and musty tomes, sat with her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the distant murmur of voices in the hall. The library's high windows emitted a watery light, casting shadows that danced across the faded portraits of Hartley ancestors, their stern gazes seeming to judge the present turmoil. Miss Marple had chosen the library for its solitude, a place where she could think undisturbed while keeping an ear on the comings and goings of the household. Clara Weston had retreated to her family's estate, overwhelmed by grief, leaving Mrs. Weston to oversee the manor's affairs with an iron will. Constable Reed was out in the village, chasing leads on Leonard Cobb, whose evasiveness only deepened suspicion. But Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on Philip Hartley, Thomas's younger brother, whose withdrawn demeanor and fleeting glances suggested a weight far heavier than mere sibling worry. Philip had been scarce since the morning's questioning, his absence noted by the staff and guests alike. Miss Marple, ever observant, had caught sight of him earlier, slipping out of the manor toward the village, his coat collar turned up against the drizzle. His excuse of a headache the previous evening had rung hollow, and Mrs. Gibbs's whispered report that he'd been seen near the old mill the night of the party piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. The mill, a crumbling relic on the village outskirts, was an odd destination for a man claiming to have retired early. She resolved to speak with him, sensing that his silence held a key to the mystery. She found Philip in the library later that afternoon, slumped in a leather armchair, a book unopened in his lap. His dark hair was disheveled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and his fingers fidgeted with the frayed cuff of his sleeve. Miss Marple approached with her usual air of gentle concern, her knitting bag slung over her arm. "Mr. Hartley," she said softly, settling into a chair opposite, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I thought a quiet word might do us both." "Good." Philip looked up, startled, his expression wary but not unkind. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I'm not much for company today." "Oh, I quite understand," she replied, her needles beginning their familiar dance. "These are trying times, especially for a brother. You and Thomas are close, I imagine." Philip's gaze dropped to the floor, and he nodded faintly. "Close enough," he said, his tone guarded. "He's always been the golden one, charming, bold. Everyone loves Thomas. The words carried a trace of bitterness, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained warm. "It must be difficult," she said, "to live in such a bright shadow. My nephew, Raymond, often speaks of his cousins with a similar mix of admiration and, well, let us say, frustration." Her voice was light, inviting confidence, and Philip's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if her words had found a crack in his defenses. "It's not that I resent him," he said, almost to himself. "But Thomas always had a way of making things look easy. Debts, promises, love, he'd charm his way out of anything. I'm not like that." Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing briefly. "And yet, you've borne your own burdens quietly. That night, at the party you left early, didn't you? Before Thomas went missing." Philip's hands stilled, and he looked at her sharply, as if sensing a trap. "I was tired," he said, echoing his earlier statement. "Too much noise. I went to my room." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Of course. But I couldn't help overhearing that you were seen in the village later, near the old mill. It's a curious place to visit at such an hour." Philip's face paled, and his fingers tightened on the armrests. "Who said that?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Oh, you know how villages are, my dear. People notice things. I only mention it because it seems odd for a man who was so tired to venture so far." Philip swallowed, his eyes darting to the window, as if seeking escape. "I couldn't sleep," he said at last. "I took a walk, that's all. Needed to clear my head." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her gaze held Philip's, steady and unyielding. "A walk to the mill," she said softly, "where no one goes at night unless they have a reason. Did you see anything there, Philip, or anyone?" He hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak, then closed again. "No," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just the river and the shadows." But Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear in his eyes, and she knew he was holding something back, something that gnawed at him like a secret too heavy to bear. She changed the subject, her tone brightening. "You must be very worried about Thomas. He's lucky to have a brother who cares so deeply." Philip's expression softened, but the strain remained. "I do worry," he admitted. "He's always taken risks, too many, maybe. Those debts." He trailed off, as if realizing he'd said too much. Miss Marple seized the opening. "Yes, the debts. I've heard Mr. Cobb was quite pressing. Did Thomas ever speak of him to you?" Philip's jaw tightened, and he nodded. "He mentioned Cobb a few times. Said he'd handle it, but I could tell it was weighing on him. Cobb's not the sort to let go easily." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her mind racing. Philip's admission confirmed Thomas's financial troubles, but his presence at the mill suggested he knew more about the night's events than he was willing to share. Had he seen Cobb, or perhaps witnessed something at the mill that he feared to reveal? The mill, with its derelict walls and rushing river, was a place of solitude, an ideal spot for a clandestine meeting or a desperate act. Determined to explore this lead, Miss Marple excused herself and took her afternoon walk to the village, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. The old mill stood on the edge of St. Mary Mead, its wheel long stilled, its stones moss-covered and crumbling. She approached with care, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign of recent activity. The riverbank was soft, churned by recent rains, and she found a few indistinct footprints, too muddled to identify. But near the mill's entrance, half hidden by a clump of nettles, she spotted a cigarette butt, its tip stained with a faint trace of lipstick. Miss Marple frowned, retrieving it with her handkerchief. Lipstick was an odd find in such a place, and none of the women at the manor, Clara, Mrs. Weston, or the maids, had been linked to the mill. She returned to the manor, her mind turning over this new clue. The cigarette suggested a woman's presence, but who? A lover perhaps, or an accomplice? The thoughts seemed fanciful, yet Miss Marple knew that even the most outlandish possibilities could hold a grain of truth. She sought out Mrs. Gibbs, who was polishing silver in the pantry, and inquired casually about visitors to the mill. "Oh, that old place," Mrs. Gibbs said, shaking her head. "No one goes there, not since it closed years ago. Though I heard young Mr. Philip was seen there the night of the party. Odd, that. He's not one for wandering." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And no one else? No strangers, perhaps, or someone unexpected?" Mrs. Gibbs paused, her cloth stilling. "Well, now you mention it, one of the lads from the Blue Boar said he saw a woman near the mill a few nights back. Didn't get a good look, too dark, but he thought she was from out of town. Wore a fancy coat, he said." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "How interesting," she said, filing away this tidbit. Back in the library, she sat with her knitting, the cigarette butt and the mill's mystery adding new threads to the tapestry. Philip's reticence, his late-night walk, the lipstick-stained cigarette all pointed to a story he was not telling. Was he protecting someone, or hiding his own involvement? Leonard Cobb remained the shadow in the background, his name tied to the scrap of paper and Thomas's debts. But Philip's behavior suggested a closer connection to the night's events. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her mind weaving through the possibilities, each click bringing her nearer to the truth buried in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 7. The Creditor's Shadow. The 5th day of Thomas Hartley's absence brought a restless energy to Hartley Manor, as if the house itself were straining against the mystery that held it captive. The village of St. Mary Mead, though outwardly calm, simmered with whispers tales of runaway grooms, secret lovers, and sinister debts. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the Manor's morning room with its faded chintz and ticking clock, knitted with her usual composure, but her mind was as sharp as the needles in her hands, threading together the clues that had surfaced. The scrap of paper marked LC £5,000 due, the tire mark by the garden gate, the cigarette butt, with its trace of lipstick, found near the old mill. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the figure of Leonard Cobb, the creditor, loomed largest, his shadow stretching across the events of that fateful night. Miss Marple had resolved to meet Cobb herself, sensing that his evasions with Constable Reed masked a deeper truth. She arranged an appointment at the village tea room, a quaint establishment with lace curtains and the comforting aroma of scones. Cobb agreed to meet, albeit grudgingly, and Miss Marple arrived early, settling at a corner table with a pot of Earl Grey and her knitting bag. The tea room was quiet, save for the murmur of 2 elderly women discussing the price of wool, and Miss Marple's unassuming presence drew no attention, a quality she had long cultivated to her advantage. Leonard Cobb entered precisely on time, his gaunt frame clad in a worn overcoat, his hat pulled low over eyes that glinted with calculation. He was a man of middle years, his face lined with the hardness of one who had clawed his way through life's margins. He sat opposite Miss Marple, his posture rigid, and declined the offer of tea with a curt shake of his head. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice like gravel, "I'm a busy man. What do you want?" His directness was not unexpected, but Miss Marple met it with her usual serenity, her needles clicking softly as she spoke. "Only a word, Mr. Cobb," she said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "You see, I'm a guest at Hartley Manor, and this dreadful business with Mr. Thomas has us all quite concerned. I understand you had dealings with him, business dealings, of course." Cobb's eyes narrowed, but he did not flinch. He owes me money," he said, £5,000, to be exact. I lent it to him for one of his schemes, some nonsense about shipping ventures. He promised repayment by the wedding, but I've seen not a penny." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "A considerable sum," she remarked. "And I believe you visited the manor recently, perhaps to discuss this debt." Cobb's fingers tightened on the brim of his hat, still clutched in his hands, I went to remind him of his obligations, he said. A week ago, in his study. He said he'd have the money soon. Something about his fiancée's family, but I wasn't at the manor the night he vanished, if that's what you're getting at. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked at him over her spectacles. Her gaze, mild but piercing. Oh, I'm sure you meant no harm, she said. But it's curious, don't you think, that you were seen near the manor gate that evening? A man of your distinctive appearance is hard to miss. Cobb's jaw clenched, and a flush crept up his sallow cheeks. Who said that? That barmaid, at the Blue Boar. She's got no business spreading tales. I was in the village, yes, but not at the manor. I had other debtors to see. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hands. A telltale sign of a man guarding his words. And this note, she continued, producing a description of the scrap of paper without revealing she'd handed it to Constable Reed, with your initials, and the sum of £5,000. It was found near the garden gate. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? Cobb's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might bolt from the tea-room, but he leaned back, forcing a thin smile. Coincidences happen, he said. Anyone could have written that. I'm not the only LC in England, and I don't go dropping notes in rose bushes. If Thomas is gone, it's not my doing. I'd rather have my money than his hide. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as placid as a village pond. Of course, Mr. Cobb, a businessman like yourself values profit over trouble. But debts can make people desperate, can they not? Both those who owe and those who collect. Cobb's smile faded, and he rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I've nothing more to say, Miss Marple. If the constable wants me, he knows where to find me. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Miss Marple to her tea and her thoughts. She lingered in the tea-room, her needles resuming their rhythm as she pondered Cobb's words. His denial was firm, but his unease was palpable, like a man who knew more than he admitted. The note, with its precise sum and initials, was too specific to be a coincidence, and his presence near the manor gate confirmed by Polly at the Blue Boar placed him at the scene. Yet Miss Marple knew that suspicion was not proof, and Cobb's ruthlessness, while evident, did not necessarily make him a kidnapper. She thought of Philip Hartley's late-night visit to the mill, the lipstick-stained cigarette, and the tire mark by the gate. Were they all threads of the same plot, or was she weaving a pattern where none existed? Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sought out Constable Reed, who was in the hall, his notebook now a tattered testament to his efforts. Any luck with Cobb? He asked, his tone hopeful but weary. Miss Marple recounted the meeting, omitting no detail, and Reed's brow furrowed. He's a hard one to pin down, he said. I checked his warehouse in the village. Nothing out of the ordinary, just crates and ledgers. But I've heard stories about him intimidating debtors, even roughing them up. If he's got Thomas stashed somewhere, he's not making it easy to find. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the warehouse. Perhaps another look. Constable, she suggested. A man like Mr. Cobb is careful, but care can breed complacency. Reed agreed, promising to organize a more thorough search. As he left, Miss Marple took a turn through the manor's garden, pausing by the gate where the note had been found. The tire mark was still visible, fainter now under the drizzle, but its presence nagged at her. It suggested a vehicle, perhaps. The motor Mrs. Gibbs had heard, and Cobb's warehouse was known to house delivery vans. The pieces were beginning to align, but gaps remained. Philip's silence, Victor's absence, Roger's polished tail. Back in the morning room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts as intricate as the pattern in her hands. Cobb was the most obvious suspect, his motive clear, and his opportunity plausible. Yet the lipstick-stained cigarette near the mill hinted at another player, someone yet to emerge from the shadows. Was it a woman, as the blue boar lad had suggested, or a red herring meant to mislead. And Philip, his presence at the mill suggested he knew something, perhaps even saw something, but fear or loyalty kept him silent. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, each stitch a step closer to the truth, as she resolved to unravel the mystery before the shadows of St. Mary Mead grew any darker. Chapter 8. The Garden's Secret. The 6th day since Thomas Hartley's disappearance cloaked Hartley Manor in a somber hush, the weight of uncertainty pressing down like the low clouds that had lingered over St. Mary Mead all morning. The village, though still whispering with theories, had begun to tire of the mystery, its gossip turning to other matters yet, within the manor's walls. The tension was palpable, a taut string waiting to snap. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wrought iron bench in the manor's rose garden, appeared to be merely enjoying the faint warmth of a rare sunbeam, her knitting a soft cascade of wool in her lap. But her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the gravel path leading to the garden gate, where clues had begun to cluster like thorns on a rosebush. The garden, with its overgrown hedges and fading blooms, was a place of faded beauty, its neglect a mirror to the Hartley family's dwindling fortunes. Miss Marple had returned here repeatedly, drawn by the smudge of mud on the terrace, the tire marked by the gate, and the scrap of paper marked LC £5,000 due. Each pointed to a moment of disruption on the night of the bachelor party, when Thomas had stepped out and vanished. The latest clue, the lipstick-stained cigarette found near the old mill, had added a new thread to the tapestry, but it was the garden that held the key. Miss Marple was Sir Thomas' silent witness to the night's secrets. She rose, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel, and retraced the path Thomas had likely taken. The French doors from the drawing-room opened onto a stone terrace, where the faint smudge of mud still lingered, now blurred by days of drizzle. Miss Marple crouched, her knees protesting, and examined it anew. The smudge was irregular, not the clean print of a shoe, but something broader, perhaps a sack dragged across the stone, or the scuff of a struggle. She followed its faint trail to the garden gate, where the tire mark she'd noticed earlier remained, etched into the soft earth. It was deeper than she'd first thought, suggesting a vehicle had idled here, its weight pressing into the ground. Miss Marple straightened, her gaze sweeping the gate and beyond, where the lane led to the village. The tire mark was no random trace. It matched the description of a van seen by the barmaid, Polly, at the Blue Boar, a van linked to Leonard Cobb's warehouse. The motor Mrs. Gibbs had heard near the service gate, the scrap of paper with Cobb's initials, the tire mark all, pointed to a calculated act, one that required Thomas to be lured or taken from this very spot. But how had it been orchestrated so seamlessly during the chaos of the party? Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple returned to the manor and sought out Constable Reed, who was in the hall, his notebook now a dog-eared relic of his tireless efforts. "Miss Marple," he said, his face brightening at her approach, "I was just about to send for you. Cobb's warehouse turned up nothing, no sign of Thomas, just crates and a few surly workers, but I'm keeping an eye on him." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've done well, Constable," she said. "But I wonder if we might revisit the garden gate. There's something there, a tire mark, quite distinct. It may match a vehicle from Mr. Cobb's warehouse." Reed's eyes widened, and he scribbled. "A note. I'll have it checked," he promised. "We've got a man in town who knows tires, used to work in a garage. If it's one of Cobb's vans, we'll know." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with encouragement. "And perhaps," she added, "you might ask about any vans seen near the manor that night. The barmaid at the Blue Boar mentioned one, and Village Eye's Miss Little." Inspired by her suggestion, Reed organized a second search, this time focusing on the lane beyond the gate. Miss Marple accompanied him, her presence unobtrusive but her observations keen. The lane was narrow, bordered by hedgerows, and the tire mark extended a few yards before fading into the harder ground. But near a bend, half hidden by brambles, Miss Marple spotted another clue, a scrap of cloth, coarse and gray, caught on a thorn. She retrieved it with her handkerchief, noting its texture, heavy, like the kind used for sacks or workmen's aprons. It smelled faintly of oil, a detail that sent her thoughts racing back to Cobb's warehouse. Reed, examining the cloth, frowned. "Could be from a delivery van," he said. "Cobb's men use sacks like this for hauling goods. If they were here," he trailed off, his mind catching up to Miss Marple's. She nodded, her voice soft, but firm. "If they were here, Constable, it suggests Thomas didn't leave willingly. A van, a sack, a quiet lane perfect for a quick departure." Reed's face hardened, and he vowed to confront Cobb again, this time with a warrant to search his vehicles. Miss Marple returned to the manor, her mind alight with possibilities. The garden's clues to smudge, the tire mark. The cloth painted a picture of abduction, with Cobb as the likely architect. But the cigarette butt at the mill, with its trace of lipstick, lingered in her thoughts, an anomaly that refused to fit. She decided to revisit the manor's staff, seeking any overlooked detail about the night of the party. In the kitchen, she found Elsie, the scullery maid, polishing silver with a distracted air. "Elsie," Miss Marple said, her tone warm, "you were so helpful about Mr. Grange's movements. Did you happen to notice anything else that night, perhaps someone near the garden, or a sound out of place?" Elsie hesitated, her freckled face flushing. "Well, miss, I didn't want to say before, but I heard something odd. After Mr. Grange went to the cellar, I was by the service door, fetching water. There was a sort of scuffle, like boots on gravel, and then a low voice, angry, like, I couldn't make out words, but it came from the garden gate." Miss Marple's needles, which she'd retrieved from her bag, slowed. "And did you see anyone?" she asked. Elsie shook her head. "Too dark, miss. But I thought I saw a shadow move tall, like a man, but not Mr. Thomas. Then I heard the motor, like Mrs. Gibbs said." This new detail tightened the knot of suspicion around Cobb, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on the other suspects. Victor's absence in the scullery, Philip's secretive walk to the mill. Roger's polished tailage could be complicit, wittingly or not. She thanked Elsie and returned to the garden, her eyes drawn to the gate once more. The clues were mounting, but the why and how remained elusive. Had Cobb acted alone, or had someone within the manor aided him, perhaps unwittingly opening the gate at the right moment? As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting a steady rhythm against the gathering dark. The garden had spoken, its secrets emerging in mud and cloth, but the full story was still hidden, like a rosebud yet to bloom. Cobb's shadow loomed large, but the cigarette at the mill and Philip's silence suggested other hands at work. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step toward the truth, as she prepared to unravel the final threads of St. Mary Mead's quiet drama. Chapter 9. The motive unraveled. The 7th day since Thomas Hartley's disappearance broke with a restless dawn. The sky over St. Mary Mead streaked with clouds that promised rain but held back, as if mirroring the village's suspended state of hope and dread. Hartley Manor, its once vibrant halls, now hushed, seemed to lean inward, guarding its secrets with the stubbornness of old stone. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the manor's drawing room with its heavy drapes and ticking grandfather clock, knitted. With her usual calm, her needles a quiet metronome against the tension that hung in the air. Her mind, however, was anything but still, weaving together the clues that had emerged: the smudge of mud, the tire mark, the scrap of paper, the oil-stained cloth, and the perplexing cigarette butt with its trace of lipstick. Each pointed to a deliberate act, and Leonard Cobb, the creditor, stood at the heart of her suspicions, yet the roles of others, Philip, Roger, Victor, remained tantalizingly unclear. The morning brought a breakthrough. Constable Red, his face alight with urgency, burst into the drawing room, his helmet askew. Miss Marple exclaimed, drawing the attention of Clara Weston and her mother, who sat nearby, their faces etched with strain. "We've found him, Thomas. He's alive, locked in a storeroom at Cobb's warehouse. My men are bringing him to the manor now, and Cobb's under arrest." Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, while Mrs. Weston's eyes narrowed. Her expression, a mix of relief and cold resolve. Miss Marple's needles paused, her lips curving into a faint smile. "That is excellent news, Constable," she said. "How is he found?" Reed recounted the search, prompted by Miss Marple's suggestion to re-examine Cobb's warehouse. The tire mark by the garden gate had matched a van registered to Cobb's business, and a second, more thorough search had uncovered a locked storeroom hidden behind crates of grain. There, bound but unharmed, was Thomas, pale and shaken but alive. "Cobb's men tried to bolt," Reed said, "but we nabbed 2 of them. They're not talking yet, but Cobb's in custody, and we'll get answers soon enough." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning to the why and how of the abduction. For the discovery of Thomas was not the end of the mystery, but the key to its heart. Thomas arrived at the manor within the hour, supported by a burly constable, his face gaunt but his eyes bright with relief. Clara rushed to him, her tears mingling with soft words of reassurance, while Mrs. Weston stood apart, her gaze sharp as she assessed him. The drawing-room filled with a flurry of activity, servants fetching brandy, guests murmuring their relief. Miss Marple remained in her corner, her knitting resumed, her eyes fixed on Thomas as he sank into a chair. His story, halting at first, poured out under Clara's gentle prompting. "It was Cobb," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "That night, at the party, I got a note slipped under my glass, said to meet someone at the garden gate to settle my debt. I thought it was Cobb, offering a last chance to talk terms. I was tipsy, careless. I went out alone. Next thing I knew, 2 men grabbed me, threw a sack over my head, and bundled me into a van. They took me to the warehouse, locked me in that room. Cobb came later, said he'd hold me until Clara paid the £5,000. He thought her family's wealth would cover it." Thomas's hands trembled as he accepted a glass of brandy, his gaze flickering to Philip, who had entered silently and stood by the door, his face unreadable. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind piecing together the details. The note under the glass was new, a clever lure that exploited Thomas's recklessness and his desperation to clear his debts before the wedding. The tire mark, the oil-stained cloth, the motor heard by Mrs. Gibbs, all aligned with Cobb's plan, executed with ruthless precision during the party's chaos. But the cigarette butt at the mill, with its trace of lipstick, remained an outlier, a thread that refused to weave neatly into the pattern. And Philip's presence at the mill that night, why had he gone there? And what had he seen? She turned her attention to Philip, whose silence was as telling as Thomas's tale. "Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you must be greatly relieved to see your brother safe. But I wonder if you might help clarify something. That night, you were seen near the old mill, long after you said you'd retired. Did you see anything or anyone that might shed light on this affair?" The room stilled, all eyes turning to Philip, whose pallor deepened. He hesitated, his fingers twisting together, then spoke in a low voice. I didn't want to say," he began, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I saw Cobb near the manor gate earlier that evening, when I stepped out for a walk. He was with another man, someone I didn't know, talking in low voices. I didn't think much of it, then just assumed it was about the debt, but later, after I left the party, I couldn't sleep. I went to the mill, just to think. I saw a van there, parked in the shadows, and heard voices again, angry ones. I got scared and left. I didn't want to get involved, not with Cobb. I thought if I said anything, it'd make things worse for Thomas." His voice broke, and he looked at his brother, his eyes filled with guilt. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. Philip's fear of Cobb explained his silence, but it also confirmed the creditor's presence at the manor and the mill, tying him more tightly to the crime. She turned to Roger Blake and Victor Grange, who had joined the gathering, their faces a study in contrasting emotions. Roger's forced relief, Victor's nervous fidgeting. "Mr. Blake," she said, "your friendship with Thomas must make this a great relief. And Mr. Grange, your splendid party, though marred, served its purpose in bringing us together. But I wonder, did either of you notice a note passed to Thomas that night? It seems such a small thing, yet so pivotal." Roger shook his head, his smile strained. "I was too busy keeping the party going. Miss Marple didn't see any note." Victor, however, flushed, his hands jerking to his ledger, which he clutched like a shield. "I was in the scullery, or the cellar most of the time," he said quickly. "I didn't see anything like that." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him, noting the sweat beading on his brow. His absence at the critical moment, his proximity to the service gate, made him a potential weak link in the evening's chain of events, though she sensed he was more negligent than complicit. The cigarette butt at the mill nagged at her, its lipstick a discordant note in Cobb's otherwise meticulous plan. Had a woman been involved, perhaps as a lookout or a distraction? The barmaid's tale of a stranger in a fancy coat near the mill suggested a possibility, but no such figure had emerged among the manor's guests or staff. Miss Marple filed it away, knowing that some clues, like seeds, took time to sprout as the room buzzed with relief and questions. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag. "Constable," she said softly, "you've done splendidly, but perhaps a word with Mr. Cobb's men might clarify how that note reached Thomas. Someone at the party must have placed it." Reed nodded, his resolve renewed, and promised to interrogate the captured men. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room to Miss, safe but shaken, Clara, clinging to hope, Philip, burdened by his silence, Roger and Victor, each hiding their own unease. Cobb's motive was clear, but the mechanics of the abduction, its timing, its execution suggested a precision that might have required an insider's touch. The truth was close, Miss Marple felt, like a pattern nearly complete, and she would not rest until the final stitch was in place. Chapter 10. The village restored. The 8th day since Thomas Hartley's disappearance, or rather, his abduction, dawned with a tentative brightness, as if St. Mary Mead itself exhaled in relief at his safe return. Hartley Manor, though still shadowed by the week's ordeal, stirred with renewed life, its halls echoing with the soft bustle of servants preparing for a quieter day. The clouds that had loomed over the village parted, admitting shafts of sunlight that gilded the manor's ivy-clad walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with its familiar chintz and ticking clock, knitted with her characteristic calm, her needles a steady rhythm against the lingering questions that danced in her mind. Thomas was safe, Leonard Cobb was in custody, and yet the mystery, like a tapestry with one loose thread, was not fully resolved. The drawing room, where Thomas had recounted his harrowing tale the previous day, was now a scene of cautious celebration. Clara Weston, her auburn hair neatly pinned, sat beside Thomas, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes bright with a mixture of joy and lingering fear. Thomas, though pale and thinner from his confinement, managed a weak smile, his charm undimmed despite the ordeal. Mrs. Weston, ever vigilant, stood by the window, her sharp gaze sweeping the room, as if to ensure no further threats lurked. Roger Blake and Victor Grange were present, their relief tempered by an undercurrent of unease, while Philip Hartley lingered near the door, his face a mask of quiet guilt. Miss Marple, observing from her corner, noted the dynamics with her usual acuity. The discovery of Thomas in Cobb's warehouse, the tire mark matching his van, and the oil-stained cloth had all pointed to a meticulously planned abduction, driven by Cobb's greed for the £5,000 Thomas owed. Yet the cigarette butt with its trace of lipstick, found near the old mill, remained an enigma, as did the note slipped under Thomas's glass, a detail that suggested someone within the manor had played a role, however unwitting. Miss Marple. Needles clicked softly, her thoughts weaving through the final threads of the mystery. Constable Reed entered, his face flushed with the satisfaction of a case nearly closed. Miss Marple, he said, nodding to her before addressing the room, I've had a word with Cobb's men. One of them, cracked under questioning, admitted they were hired to grab Thomas at the garden gate. Cobb planned it all, down to the note under the glass. Said he paid a serving girl to slip it to Thomas during the party, knowing he'd take the bait. Clara gasped, and Thomas's jaw tightened, his hand closing over Clara's. A serving girl, Mrs. Weston said sharply. Who? Reed hesitated, glancing at Miss Marple, who gave a slight nod, encouraging him to continue. It was Elsie, the scullery maid, he said. She didn't know what it was about, just thought it was a message from a friend. Cobb gave her a shilling and told her to keep quiet. She's in a state now, poor thing, but she's not in trouble. She had no idea what Cobb was planning. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, recalling Elsie's nervous demeanor in the kitchen. The girl's innocence was plausible, but the lipstick-stained cigarette at the mill suggested another woman's involvement. One yet to be identified. Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle but clear. Constable, you've done splendidly, and Elsie's part explains the note. But I wonder about that cigarette found near the mill, the one with the lipstick. It's a curious detail, don't you think? Not many women in St. Mary Mead frequent that old place at night. Reed frowned, scratching his head. I'd almost forgotten about that, he admitted. We asked around, but no one's come forward. Could be a stranger, like the lad at the Blue Boar, seat a woman in a fancy coat. Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind turning to the barmaid's tale of a mysterious woman near the mill. Perhaps, she said, but villages have long memories. Someone may yet recall seeing her. She turned to Philip, who had remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Mr. Hartley, she said softly, you were at the mill that night. Did you see a woman, perhaps, or anything that might help us tie up this loose end? Philip's head jerked up, his face pale. I told you, I didn't see much, he said, his voice strained. Just the van, and voices. I didn't stay long. Miss Marple's gaze was kind but unwavering. Of course, my dear, but sometimes the smallest detail, even a shadow, can make all the difference. Philip swallowed, his hands clenching. There was a figure, he said at last, his voice barely audible, near the mill, in the trees. I thought it was a woman, tall, in a long coat. But it was dark, and I was too far to see clearly. I didn't want to get closer, not with Cobb's men there. His admission, though vague, sent a ripple through the room, and Miss Marple nodded, satisfied that Philip's fear had kept him silent but not dishonest. The mystery of the cigarette remained unresolved, but Miss Marple sensed it was a peripheral thread, perhaps a remnant of an unrelated encounter at the mill. The heart of the case, Cobb's abduction of Thomas, was clear. His greed, fueled by the prospect of Clara's family wealth, had driven him to orchestrate a kidnapping, exploiting the chaos of the bachelor party and Thomas's vulnerability. Roger Blake, with his old grudge over an unpaid loan, had been a distraction, his unease born of personal resentment rather than guilt. Victor Grange's absence at the critical moment was negligence, not complicity, his obsession with perfection, blinding him to the plot unfolding under his nose. Philip's silence, rooted in fear of Cobb and loyalty to his brother, had delayed the truth but not obscured it. As the afternoon wore on, Clara and Thomas announced their intention to postpone the wedding, allowing time for recovery and reflection. We'll marry, Clara said, her voice firm, but not until this shadow is fully lifted. Mrs. Weston, though visibly displeased, acquiesced, her priority now ensuring Cobb's prosecution. Miss Marple, rising from her chair, offered her congratulations to Thomas and Clara, her smile warm but her eyes still searching. "You've been through a great deal, my dear," she said to Clara. "But love, like truth, has a way of enduring." She took a final turn through the garden, pausing by the gate where Thomas had been taken. The tire mark was gone now, washed away by rain, but the memory of it lingered, a testament to the greed that had nearly torn a family apart. Back in the morning room, Miss Marple packed her knitting, her work here nearly done. The village of St. Mary Mead would return to its quiet rhythms, its secrets buried once more beneath its pastoral charm. She thought of the cigarette at the mill, the woman in the fancy coat, a mystery unsolved. But not every thread needed weaving to complete the pattern. As she prepared to return to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the frailties of human nature: greed, fear, loyalty, love. They were the same in every village, every heart, and she had seen them all before, in different guises. Her needles, now stilled, had woven their part, and the truth had emerged, as it always did, in the quiet corners of observation. With a small sigh, she closed her bag, ready for the next puzzle that might cross her path, knowing St. Mary Mead would never be quite as sleepy as it seemed.